Godzilla history is divided into four eras, or five if you count the MonsterVerse. The Showa era is Godzilla's beginning, starting with the original Gojira in 1954 and ending with Terror of Mechagodzilla in 1975. Godzilla returned, logically, in The Return of Godzilla in 1984, kicking off the Heisei era that ended with Godzilla's definitive death in Godzilla vs. Destoroyah in 1995. But it's hard to keep a good monster down, and Godzilla returned again in Godzilla 2000, kicking off the Millennium era that ended with the 50th anniversary film Godzilla Final Wars in 2004. Then came the MonsterVerse, and the informally designated Reiwa era, Godzilla's current era. The Reiwa era might be the strangest and most experimental era in Godzilla history. I've even nicknamed it Godzilla's art house movie era, but it strongly parallels the preceding Millennium series. Each era has a different flavor. The Showa era was mainly big monster brawls with actors in suits stomping across miniature cities, but also carried an air of cool, mid-century sci-fi retrofuturism. The Heisei era picked this up and amplified it, with more modern effects, into a concerted effort at an overarching continuity that was only nascently present in the Showa era's interweaving cinematic universe. The Millennium era began as a response to the failure of Hollywood's first attempt to appropriate Godzilla, the 1998 TriStar film directed by Roland Emmerich. It, like most Emmerich films, was a piece of crap. Even with the monster retconned to Zilla instead of Godzilla, it's still unwatchable. To rescue the reputation of their monster, Japan released Godzilla 2000 in 1999. But unlike the Heisei or even the Showa era, the Millennium era forewent a single continuity. Instead, each film stood more or less alone as a sequel to the original 1954 film, giving their own unique takes on Godzilla. Godzilla vs. Megaguirus, released in 2000, was not a sequel to Godzilla 2000, but was a big classical monster brawl. 2001's Godzilla, Mothra, King Ghidorah, Giant Monsters All Out Attack was an allegory of Japan's wartime transgressions. Whereas Godzilla had previously been an embodiment of Japan's victimization through the atomic and fire bombings of World War II, this Godzilla was a vengeful spirit of Imperial Japan's victims coming for vengeance. Godzilla against Mechagodzilla and Godzilla Tokyo SOS, released in 2002 and 2003 respectively, actually do form their own continuity, with the former as, essentially, a live-action mecha anime. And finally, Final Wars is just a wild, balls-to-the-wall crazy remake of Destroy All Monsters through the lens of The Matrix and Power Rangers. The Reiwa era mirrors this. It began as a reaction against the MonsterVerse and 2014's Godzilla by Legendary Pictures and Warner Brothers. Though popular enough in and outside Japan to spawn an entire cinematic universe, Godzilla 2014 is still one of the worst movies I have ever seen, for reasons I've articulated in other videos. As a reaction to it and against it, Toho commissioned the mastermind behind one of the most popular anime series of all time to create his own startling vision of Godzilla. This was Shin Gojira, a total reboot and remake of the original Gojira released in 2016. Whereas even the Millennium films, for all their disjointed lack of continuity, still recognized the original 1954 film as their starting point, Shin Gojira wipes it all away and makes a truly new Godzilla for a new age. And yet, it is closer in thematic depth to the original than any other film that came after. Anno Hideaki went back to the thematic source and deployed Godzilla as a metaphor for Japan's tragic relationship with atomic power. This time not as the atomic bomb, but rather the 2011 tsunami and Fukushima nuclear power plant disaster. But more than that, it was a scathing black comedy on the Japanese government's bureaucratic inaction in dealing with this disaster. Hideaki was no stranger to the genre or how to reimagine it in an engaging way. His best-known work is the anime Neon Genesis Evangelion, a partial homage and partial critique of mecha anime and the tropes of Ultraman. Instead of an ultra-competent young ace pilot using technology to save humankind from alien invasion, we have a clinically depressed and anxiety-riddled boy forced into an apocalyptic war in which humanity themselves are the enemy. All as an allegory for Hideaki's own struggle with mental illness. Hideaki then went on to write Giant God Warrior Appears in Tokyo in 2012. This live-action short film was a prequel to Hayao Miyazaki's anime film and manga series Nausicaa of the Valley of the Wind, showing the titular living atomic weapon's apocalyptic judgment on humankind. This short helped to coalesce the form that Shin Gojira would take. Its scathing critique of modern society, its use of puppetry and CGI, its modern approach to kaiju tokusatsu filmmaking, and the unsettlingly visceral body horror of its monster. These elements all came together beautifully in Shin Gojira, making it easily the single best Godzilla movie since 1954, arguably still the best since 1954, stiffly competing with another Reiwa-era film. I suppose it's really more a matter of taste, and in that respect, Shin Gojira meets my tastes for black political satire and kaiju body horror better than Godzilla Minus One's aching character drama of wartime trauma. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Whatever one's tastes, it would be hard to argue that there is a more beautiful Godzilla film. From its cinematography, to its colors, to its score, Shin Gojira is undoubtedly the most artful and dynamic Godzilla film. The film is awe-inspiring. Yes, it is satire, and yes, it begins rather humorously as a cell phone-addicted population records a flopping and flailing Kamada-kun for internet consumption, while the government shuffles from meeting to meeting to meeting to meeting, but that levity does not last. The greatest testament to Shin Gojira is the stark contrast in how audiences reacted to it versus how they reacted to Godzilla 2014. In 2014, when Godzilla lets loose with his atomic breath and destroys the Mutos, it was to rousing cheers in the theater. In Shin Gojira, when he belches fire and concentrates it into a single laser beam that cuts an unrelenting swath through Tokyo to the melancholy strains of a chorale, nobody was saying anything. Aside from the film itself, you could have heard a pin drop. The entire theater was speechless at the horror and spellbinding beauty of it. As horrific and spellbindingly beautiful as Godzilla himself was, this was the first Godzilla I was ever truly scared by. Hideaki perfected Godzilla as a physical embodiment of nuclear body horror. Whereas the texture of the original Godzilla was meant to echo the keloid scarring of Hiroshima victims, Shin Gojira's skin is blackened and cracked, the muscle underneath showing through and radiating with nuclear fission. He looks like a burn victim in perpetual agony, like something that must die and cannot. His head is just a burnt mass of teeth with two beady, unfeeling eyes. His hands are clawed and upturned, like a writhed and burnt corpse. And his tail, bleh! Shin Gojira is a giant, ambulatory, cancerous tumor that lurches unthinkingly and unfeelingly across the city. My only regret with the film is that we did not get to see Hideaki's full concept come to fruition, including the fissioned-off Godzilloids being creepy naked women, which would be a very Anno Hideaki move. Instead, we still get a poignant end, with Japan neutralizing Godzilla but not destroying him, having to learn to live with the threat that Godzilla, and by extension nuclear power, poses. Though certainly set up for a sequel, we are almost a decade on from the film and there's really no need for it. Shin Gojira stands on its own as one of the most remarkable Godzilla films. Now, the problem with the Reiwa era being Godzilla's art house film phase is that art house movies are not for everyone. Those fans who preferred Godzilla as a heroic monster brawler detested Shin Gojira as no real Godzilla movie at all. I was even bullied out of an online Godzilla fan group for the temerity to like both King Kong and Japanese Academy Award Best Picture winner Shin Gojira. Personally, I think everything that could be done with Godzilla as a monster brawler has pretty much been done over the past 70 years. I'm very much excited by seeing more inventive, novel, and interesting approaches to the franchise, which is why the Reiwa era is so great. After Shin Gojira came one of the most controversial entries into the entire Godzilla franchise, the anime trilogy produced by Netflix and Polygon. Whereas the medium of anime implicitly promised an inconceivable scale of Godzilla battles, what it delivered was a deeply introspective, philosophical trilogy of science fiction feature films that left many Godzilla fans disappointed. As I said, Shin Gojira was already trying the patience of that certain kind of Godzilla fan who only likes big monster brawls. The anime trilogy snapped it completely and catalyzed the Reiwa era as Godzilla's art house movie era. Destroy All Monsters, Final Wars, or the Heisei era, this was not. Despite whatever pacing problems the combined 4 hours of the trilogy might have, it is a fascinating exploration of philosophical themes through the contrasts of its 4 humanoid species and their respective allegorical monsters. Central to the trilogy, and especially the first film, Godzilla Planet of Monsters, is the relationship between humankind and Godzilla itself. Godzilla is the product and embodiment of all of humankind's hatred, violence, and alienation from nature, the ultimate end of humanity's path of warfare, industrialization, and technological development. When Godzilla proved unstoppable in the 21st century, a remnant of humanity fled the planet along with our extraterrestrial allies in their religiously devout Ekshif and genius engineers Saludos, only to return 20 years later in relative time when a young human, Haro, developed a workable strategy to finally take him down. However, 20 years in relativistic time was 20,000 years of elapsed time on Earth. In the intervening millennia, the entire planet adapted to Godzilla's biology, a mirror of our own Anthropocene epoch, and a place where the plants, monstrous wildlife, and even the air itself are completely hostile to human life. Godzilla has made Earth unfit for human habitation, just as we are making Earth unfit for nature. The second film, Godzilla City on the Edge of Battle, introduces the Hutua. These may be a remnant of humankind, bound in some strange biological and telepathic way to a giant Mothra egg, who have learned the precious art of coexistence with Godzilla-dominated nature. A mutation that allows them to grow moth-like scales not only gives them a Mothra-like orange and white appearance, but also protects them from the physical hostilities of Godzilla's world. These scales, applied to the survivors of the previous film, also have healing properties that, in turn, prove very useful when the Saludo betray not merely humankind, but the very idea of humanity itself. The Saludo are secularists and engineers at heart, disdaining the primitive Hutua and superstitious Ekshif alike. Their monster is Mechagodzilla, developed in the 21st century from experimental nanotechnology. Godzilla destroyed the facility, and they were forced to abandon Mechagodzilla, but discover upon their return 20,000 years later that Mechagodzilla's nanites survived and continued their evolution. Now, in a kind of perverse imitation of Godzilla and realization of human industrialization, Mechagodzilla's nanotechnology has developed into a slowly spreading city complex. Commandeering the city, the Saludo offer the only real hope of destroying the 300-meter-tall Godzilla. But that offer comes at a Faustian price. In short, they must out-Godzilla. Rather than reclaiming the planet from Godzilla for the benefit of humankind, it requires surrendering humankind to nanite assimilation into Mechagodzilla's city, sacrificing their humanity, and then allowing the city of pure technology to assimilate the planet itself. Mechagodzilla represents one form of total alienation from nature, a culmination of the same processes of alienation, pollution, and destruction that birthed Godzilla to begin with. As one of the Billisoluto themselves put it, this was the inevitable destiny of humankind since the first man took the first axe to the first tree. The protection from nanite assimilation provided by the Hutua scales becomes the focal point for a religious revival in the trilogy's third part, Godzilla the Planet Eater. But this revival is not a turn to the coexisting ways of the Hutua with their communal psychic unity. Instead, it is capitalized on by the Ekshif, who have spent generations leading humanity down the path toward the creation of Godzilla, as an offering for their own deity, an extra-dimensional eldritch horror named Ghidorah. Here, the story is motivated by a central conflict between the Hutua worldview and that of the Ekshif, the former affirming life and the latter embracing death. One of the things the trilogy does very well is articulating profound differences in philosophy. These different species are not just variations on the views of the writers, like Star Trek's Federation, who are an infinite diversity of American secular democratic socialists with misshapen foreheads. Many narrative points are built around the fact that these different species think in profoundly, fundamentally different ways. The Billisoluto think that assimilation into Mechagodzilla is obviously good, so how is it even a debate? The horror of their assimilation into Mechagodzilla is made all the more terrifying by how they cannot even understand why anyone would object. This technological domination over flesh is just the next inevitable step in evolution. They see the humans as traitors for resisting it. The Hutua express confusion over the human desire to defeat Godzilla. In their worldview, to win is to survive and coexist. To lose is to die. To defeat Godzilla would be like trying to defeat the seas or the storms. To defeat and dominate is not even in their vocabulary. Meanwhile, the Ekshif embraced a nihilistic worship of annihilation, when their own world went through the process of progress, creation of their own Godzilla, and total destruction at the tripartite maw of Ghidorah, summoned into our universe to consume the monsters produced by civilization. They came to see this cycle of growth and collapse as the inevitable purpose of the universe. The purpose of existence was to die, as an offering to entropy embodied by Ghidorah. There was no win or loss, only acceptance of inevitability. While many were unsatisfied with the trilogy because it was more of a philosophy sessional than it was just monsters punching each other, I will say that it provided the only version of Ghidorah that I've ever been truly afraid of. What Shin Gojira did for Godzilla, the Planet Eater did for Ghidorah, as a terrifying Lovecraftian entity from beyond reality whose mere presence warps space and time around it. I would imagine that audiences in the 1960s watching Ghidorah materialize for the first time in Ghidorah the Three-Headed Monster, or again in Invasion of Astro Monster, felt much the way I did, watching Ghidorah's horrific time-twisting attack on the human spaceship, and seeing Godzilla's atomic blast helplessly warp around him, while the instrumentation says Ghidorah isn't even there. In the end, the trilogy closes out with a downer. Ultimately, this is a Moses story. We're familiar with the hero's journey of the messianic warrior who overcomes death to defeat the villain and bring back the Golden Fleece. Fewer are familiar with the Moses story. Few even know how Moses' story actually ends. They might know about the whole Prince of Egypt part and the Ten Commandments, but the part of the story that is often discreetly left out is that Moses himself dies on the border of the Promised Land. After their escape from slavery in Egypt, the Hebrews spent 40 years in the desert, so that the generation of those who experienced slavery and oppressive Egyptian ways of thought died out. The Promised Land was supposed to be a new start, with a new way of life for a new generation. And unfortunately, that meant that even Moses himself needed to die. The prophet is doomed never to see their prophecy come true, never to enjoy the utopia they led others to. Likewise, humankind is not able to have a new start on a Godzilla-dominated Earth until the old ways, old technologies, and old hatred is truly gone. The philosophical abstractions of the anime trilogy were only compounded by Netflix's next anime series, Godzilla Singular Point. If the trilogy was too heady, well, get ready for some time-twisting quantum mechanics requiring a graduate degree. Similar in this sense to the trilogy, Singular Point is an exploration of the inevitabilities of scientific, technological, and industrial development, the emergence of consciousness, and the struggle for survival. It is also, on a more pedestrian level, one of the most inventive with how it reimagines the classic kaiju. Singular Point reworks the kaiju from the ground up. Instead of towering above the skyscrapers, these are a smaller scale and much more dinosaur-like creatures, but terrifying in an entirely new way. These kaiju act as interlopers from the quantum realm, living nodes in a kind of quantum supercomputing system that manifests a reality-destroying agent in Godzilla itself. Singular Point has both my favorite versions of Rodan and Anguirus, and I appreciate how its new kaiju, as well as Godzilla's various evolutions, are hybridizations of classic kaiju, like Salunga's fusion of Baragon and Gabra, or the giant insects having features from Kumonga, Kamacuras, Megalon, Gigan, and even Hedorah, or Godzilla's various forms resembling Titanosaurus, Varan, and Gorosaurus, before reaching his final, most Godzilla-esque form. Godzilla's poke-evolving is itself an inheritance from Shin Gojira, and if nothing else, this inventiveness with its kaiju is reason to commend the series. Singular Point also inherited the concept of extra-dimensional kaiju from the anime trilogy. The story revolves around Godzilla being a singularity where another universe, or he is a universe in himself, is crossing over into our universe. But the Godzilla we see, or any of his various forms, is just the tip of the iceberg, an eldritch extra-dimensional horror that we are only seeing a part of an angle of in the three-dimensional space of our universe. The series itself, or at least the end credits of each episode, throw in copious Easter eggs and references suggesting that other eras of Godzilla all coexist in the Singular Point multiverse. But these mutations, hybridizations, and adaptations of the kaiju all reinforce the show's overall theme of quantum evolution and the emergence of consciousness. A third series of animated shorts was released on sequential Godzilla Day festivities on November 3rd, 2022 and 2023. Both Godzilla vs. Gigan Rex and Godzilla vs. Megalon were directed by Takuya Iwanishi and were both ostensibly a continuation of the Heisei era in CGI animation. Godzilla vs. Gigan Rex begins exactly where Godzilla vs. Destoroyah leaves off, presumably showing us the continuing adventures of Little, Godzilla Jr., as an adult, and fighting off excellently reimagined versions of some classic Showa monsters that never made it into the Heisei era proper. And they even worked in Godzilla's infamous dropkick. Though only clocking in at 10 minutes each, these were a delightful treat for those who value pure monster-on-monster action. Their brevity, however, would seem to endorse my thought on the limitations of pure monster-on-monster action here in Godzilla's 71st year. Even the Monsterverse had to farm out the role of protagonist to Kong. Godzilla Day was also the venue for a series of 4 short live-action films, each directed by Kazuhiro Nakagawa and utilizing the leftover or recreated suits from previous Godzilla films. It began in 2020 with Godzilla Appears at Godzilla Fest, a loving tribute to the process of making Godzilla films, but came into its own with 2021's Godzilla vs. Hedorah, making use of both suits from Final Wars. This was followed by Fest Godzilla 3 Gigan Attacks in 2022 utilizing the Final Wars Godzilla suit opposite a fan-funded recreation of the Showa Gigan suit. The remaining shorts were 2023's Fest Godzilla 4, Operation Jet Jaguar, and 2024's Fest Godzilla 5, All Monsters Showdown. These brought back Jet Jaguar in a recreated suit, upgraded him with Gigan's claws, and had him and Godzilla team up against the Ghidorah suit from Godzilla Mothra King Ghidorah Giant Monsters All Out Attack. Altogether, they make a charming 40-minute narrative throwback to the old monster brawls. And then, of course, came Godzilla Minus One, a film that I reviewed on its own when it came out, and for which I don't really have to say anything. Minus One captured global attention like no Godzilla movie before it, with a tragic, human-centered drama meditating on the horrors of war and Japan's complicated and traumatic history with it. Director Takashi Yamazaki perfectly balanced human story and monster action in a way that few Godzilla films do. As discussion swirls around Yamazaki's contract for a second Godzilla film, Minus One raises some interesting questions for Godzilla and for film in general. Nobody knows for sure if the next Yamazaki Godzilla film will actually be a sequel to Minus One, or whether Minus One, like Shin Gojira before it, is perfectly good as a standalone picture. But it is fascinating that Minus One is a period piece, going back to the Showa era. That is Yamazaki's wheelhouse, as evidenced by his retro Showa historical dramas Always Sunset on 3rd Street trilogy, The Eternal Zero, and The Great War of Archimedes, as well as the movie for the Godzilla theme park attraction at the Showa-themed Seibuan Park near Tokyo. Is Godzilla a fundamentally Showa phenomenon? Does Godzilla always work best in the post-war, mid-century milieu, as a reaction against the ending of World War II, and situated where our technology was not quite enough to actually defeat him permanently? Is it actually possible for Godzilla to keep up with modern technology and modern concerns? And what light does this shed on other franchises stemming from the same time period? Should the next James Bond movie, for example, be a period piece, like Guy Ritchie's Man from U.N.C.L.E.? Is there a point in trying to keep James Bond up with the modern day, or is he fundamentally an artifact of the 1960s and the Cold War? Every attempt to translate Dracula into the modern day fails, because Dracula is fundamentally a pre-World War II character, embodying pre-World War II anxieties. 80s kids are currently outraged by leaked set photos from the upcoming He-Man movie, showing He-Man trying to navigate modern-day Earth, a story nobody wants. He-Man is a product of 80s action movie machismo, and everyone wants to see that style of film set on the fantastic alien world of Eternia. Even Shin Gojira, the most modern Godzilla movie, alludes to how, for Japan, the post-war never ended. The Reiwa era of Godzilla is giving us a fascinating case study of how what might be a fundamentally post-World War II character can be reimagined and recontextualized. Lord knows they're throwing everything at the wall, from Shin Gojira's Fukushima allegory to the anime trilogy's existentialism, to Singular Point's Quantumania, to Minus One's embracing the post-war Showa setting. This experimentation is a rich addition to Godzilla's lore, history, and future.